Well, right now, I am in Oxford at Oxford University, and right here in the main square called Radcliffe Square. There's all kinds of stuff going on here. There are people graduating, there's people getting married, there are people just walking around in their pajamas. There's a lot that's going on here. This is the oldest English-speaking university in the world. Evidence of teaching here goes back all the way to 1096. It's a prestigious university that has produced over 30 prime ministers, over 70 Nobel laureates. There are over 100 Olympic medal winners among the alumni at Oxford. And it also produced two of my favorite authors, J.R.R. Tolkien and C.S. Lewis. As I mentioned, we are currently standing in Radcliffe Square, which is the historic heart of Oxford University. And yeah, there is just a lot that is going on here today. So we're going to get out of here just as quick as we can because the crowds have been just absolutely insane. But anyway, the building that we are looking at right here is called the Radcliffe Camera, which means room in Italian. The square itself was created in the 1730s. They demolished a bunch of old medieval houses to create a university forum. So anyway, you have this magnificent building right here in the middle. And then also right here, well, this is the Church of St. Mary the Virgin. So a lot of academic ceremonies and meetings have been held here from the year 1200. Yeah, so pretty impressive to see some of these old buildings. All right, we're going to get out of the craziness now. Okay, so we escaped some of the craziness of the square. Holy cow, there was a bunch of people there. I think we have landed at Oxford on a day where there's a graduation going on or something, because man, it was just congested as heck. But anyway, here at Oxford during the 1930s and 40s, there was a literary group that called themselves the Inklings. These are guys who met together and bounced ideas off of each other and learned from one another, and we really had some amazing work that emerged from this group. Most notably from C.S. Lewis, who wrote The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, and a number of other well-known works, and also my favorite nonfiction author of all time, J.R.R. Tolkien, who of course wrote the Lord of the Rings trilogy and The Hobbit. And there is a pub nearby where the Inklings would meet every Tuesday that we're going to go check out. So we moved over to an old pub called the Eagle and Child, and naturally, as things go with me and my luck, it's closed down. Like, not closed today, but it seems to be permanently closed, which is really a shame because I was wanting to go in here and get some fish and chips and kind of sit in the same area where Tolkien and Lewis would have chatted about some of their works. But anyway, this was the meeting place for the Inklings, and man, I really wish we could go in there, but it is what it is. But you can imagine some of the conversations that were held here in this pub and the ideas that these guys bounced off of each other and how some of these amazing literary works developed due in part to the conversations that took place inside of this pub. All right, we're going to go ahead and leave here now, I guess, since we can't go in, and go check out a few of the graves of some of the members of the Inklings. We've moved over now to a place called Hopewell Cemetery, and this is the final resting place of Charles Williams, who was part of the Inklings. And he was a poet. I'm not as familiar with his work as I am, Lewis and Tolkien, but what I do know is that when he died in May of 1945, as the Second World War was coming to a close, his loss was felt deeply by his group of friends. So right here in front of us is the grave of Charles Williams, one of the Inklings. And the words of C.S. Lewis have really resonated with me, especially in the past couple of years when speaking of the death of his friend. Here's what he says. He said, "In each of my friends there is something that only some other friend can fully bring out. By myself, I am not large enough to call the whole man into activity. I want other lights than my own to show all his facets. Now that Charles is dead, I shall never again see Ronald's reaction to a specifically Charles joke." Ronald was what Lewis called Tolkien. He continues, he says, "Far from having more of Ronald, having him, quote, to myself, now that Charles is away, I have less of Ronald. Hence, true friendship is the least jealous of loves. Two friends delight to be joined by a third, and three by a fourth, if only the newcomer is qualified to become a real friend." So what he's saying there is that when he lost his friend Charles, he lost a piece of all of his other friends. So last fall, lost one of my best friends, a guy by the name of Chris. And when we lost Chris, well, I lost a piece of all of my other friends as well, because there were sometimes I would tell a joke, or I would say something that I know Chris would react to, and then I would get Craig's reaction to what Chris said, or my brother, or Ron, or Michael. But then when we lost Chris, well, I don't have their reaction to Chris anymore, and they don't have mine. So the loss was amplified. But anyway, here is the grave of one of the friends of Lewis and Tolkien, Charles Williams. When I was in high school, there was an elective class that we had the option to take called Trilogy. And in this class, the trilogy that we read was the Lord of the Rings trilogy by J.R.R. Tolkien. Now, I had already read the trilogy, I'd already read The Hobbit, was a big fan of them, so I took the class pretty confident that I would do well. And in those days, at the end of the year, well, they would have an award ceremony, and there were medals that were given out for the top performing student in each class. Not trying to brag or anything, but that year I did get the medal for the top performing student in the trilogy class. So I'm a huge fan of Lord of the Rings, the book, the movies, and all of it. And right now we've moved to Wolvercote Cemetery, which is the final resting place of the author of the Lord of the Rings, J.R.R. Tolkien. So right here among all of these graves, well, we have this one right here, which is adorned in flowers and little messages that people have left and different trinkets. And then if you come over here, well, you can see a little bit more clearly behind the flowers that this is the grave of J.R.R. Tolkien, the author of the Lord of the Rings. So Tolkien was also a World War I veteran. He was part of the Lancashire Fusiliers, took part in the Battle of the Somme, and ended up getting into what was described as like a horde of lice. And he got bit and ended up getting what was called trench fever that ended up taking him out of the fight. But it was his experiences during the First World War that really influenced him greatly. He was really big into languages as well, so there were a lot of influences, but you can definitely see the influence of the First World War in some of his writings. When you read about, like the mechanization of, the armies of Mordor, kind of, harkens to the mechanization of war in World War I. And as Frodo and Sam are going through the dead marshes, they talk about like this epic battle that had taken place there long ago. So anyway, you see all kinds of themes like that pop up in Tolkien's writing. So absolutely genius author. And here you can see different items that people have left, personal messages talking about the impact that the Lord of the Rings has had on them. And here we even got like a little Gandalf figure that is here. Now, another influence that Tolkien had on his work was his faith. So Tolkien was a devout Catholic from a young age, and while the Lord of the Rings is not, an allegory, he said that you can definitely that his faith definitely influenced his work. So in the Lord of the Rings and in the Hobbit, there are themes of good and evil, and of bearing up a burden and sacrifice for the good of others. Okay, you can see all of those different religious themes in his work. And one of the reasons that we have the Lord of the Rings is his friend, C.S. Lewis. So C.S. Lewis really encouraged Tolkien at Oxford to take some of his private writings and publish them. Yeah, so this is great. Here's the grave of J.R.R. Tolkien. I've now moved just outside of Oxford to the cemetery of the Holy Trinity Church. This is where C.S. Lewis is buried, another one of the Inklings. Now, C.S. Lewis and Tolkien would have similar backgrounds. Both of them would serve in the First World War. I think that Lewis was in the Somerset Light Infantry, if I remember correctly. Both of them served in the Battle of the Somme, and both of them would be greatly impacted by their experiences in the war. But there's an old saying by the Quakers that the same sun that melts the ice hardens the clay. And where Tolkien emerged from World War I with his faith intact, C.S. Lewis had a very different experience. He had lost his mother to cancer at age 9. His father, who was just racked with grief, ended up sending him to a boarding school. Then at age 19, he goes over and fights in World War I, was in the Battle of the Somme. And the horrors that he witnessed there led him to a place of belief that God did not exist. So he becomes a full-blown atheist after the war. Later on, he would say that he was angry at God for not existing. He couldn't believe that a God could exist and allow these horrors to take place. Well, when he becomes a professor at Oxford, becomes friends with Tolkien, and just in the same way that C.S. Lewis was a big influence on Tolkien and helped him to, pushed him to get his works out, Tolkien was going to be a very big influence on C.S. Lewis and his faith. While we are talking about the First World War, here in this cemetery, as in many places throughout England, they have a memorial to the men from this area who lost their lives in the First World War. So if we go up here, you can see that it says, "To the memory of all the men from this parish who laid down their lives in the Great War." So as I mentioned, the Great War was going to have a great influence on both Tolkien and C.S. Lewis. And at Oxford, they became friends. They had kind of a common background, both being veterans of the First World War. Both of them also lost their mothers at a young age. And they started having these conversations about God and about faith. And there were other people who were influential in C.S. Lewis's life. And both of them had an interest in Norse mythology and things like that. And C.S. Lewis's take was that Christianity was a myth, just like every other myth throughout human history, with the Greeks and the Romans and the Vikings. And well, Tolkien said, well, yeah, he said, but this one is true. kind of paraphrasing. So anyway, C.S. Lewis, I'm again paraphrasing this whole story. C.S. Lewis ends up kind of shifting his views and believing that there is a God. And he said that he became the most dejected and reluctant convert in all of England. And right here, well, we have the final resting place of C.S. Lewis. Now, even though C.S. Lewis believed in God, he wasn't a full-blown Christian at that point. That would take a few years. He said that in September of 1931, well, he was taking a trip to the zoo. He was heading out with a guy on a motorcycle in a sidecar, and he said that when he set out, here's what he says. He says, "When I set out, I did not believe that Jesus Christ was the Son of God, but when we had reached the zoo, I did. I had not exactly spent the journey in thought nor in great emotion. Emotional is perhaps the last word we can apply to some of the most important events. It was more like when a man, after a long sleep, still lying motionless on the bed, becomes aware that he is now awake." So that was C.S. Lewis's conversion experience. And this man is going to become one of the most influential Christian authors in history. He has a couple great books. One of them is called Mere Christianity. There's another one called Surprised by Joy. And he's also going to become the author of the Chronicles of Narnia series. Probably the most well-known of his books is The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. Now, unlike Tolkien, whose work was influenced by faith, C.S. Lewis, his work is Christian allegory. So, like the lion Aslan is the Christ-like figure in his book. But anyway, that's a little bit on C.S. Lewis, and here is his final resting place. All right, well, there you go. Those were a few of the graves of the Inklings from Oxford. C.S. Lewis and J.R.R. Tolkien are two men who were greatly influential to me in my younger years with their writings. So to be able to come here today and to visit their graves and pay my respects is really something. But anyway, as for right now, our trip is kind of winding down, so we're going to be headed off to the next place.